Hello, incurable romantics. Prepare to travel back in time to an era of glittering nights and shadowed alleys, where love was a dangerous and intoxicating cocktail. Let us open the first page. The world of Miss Lillian Rowe was bound in calfskin and smelling of aged paper and lemon polish. It was a world of profound and sepulchral silence, broken only by the rustle of a turning page, the soft cough of a browsing scholar, or the gentle thud of a returned volume of poetry placed upon her mahogany desk. Here, within the hallowed halls of the Boston Public Library, the cacophony of 1925, the blare of jazz trumpets, the frantic roar of Ford T-engines, the shrill laughter of flappers with their painted lips and rolled stockings, was nothing but a distant, muffled hum, an incoherent story told in a language she had no desire to learn. Lillian preferred the classics. She preferred heroes whose honor was their shield, and heroines whose virtue was their crown. In the novels of Wharton and Austen, she found a logic, a satisfying moral arithmetic where actions had clear consequences and love, however fraught with trial, was an orderly progression toward a foregone conclusion. Life, she believed, should be like a well-ordered novel. Her own was a modest, slim volume, perhaps, but one in which every chapter followed the last with comforting predictability. She was 24, but in the soft, scholarly light that filtered through the great arched windows of the reading room, she could have been any age. Her brown hair was pinned in a neat, sensible chignon at the nape of her neck, a stark contrast to the severe, shingled bobs that were the height of fashion. Her dresses were modest, with hemlines that dutifully grazed her mid-calf and necklines that knew their place. She wore no rouge, no powder, only the faint scholarly pallor that came from a life lived indoors, among the quiet company of a million silent voices bound in print. Today, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden fingers across the marble floor, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny, forgotten spirits in the air. The great clock above the main entrance chimed 5, its resonant gongs echoing through the vaulted space. It was the sound of release for most, but for Lillian it was merely a transition. She still had the returns cart from the history section to process, a teetering metal beast laden with tomes on the Great War, ancient Rome, and the fledgling years of the American Republic. As she methodically stamped each book, her slender fingers tracing the return date with practiced efficiency, she felt a familiar sense of peace. This was her sanctuary. Here chaos was catalogued, history was contained, and human folly was neatly confined to the printed page. She slid a heavy biography of Napoleon onto its correct shelf, the leather spine cool against her palm. She could lose herself for hours in this silent city of stories, a far more appealing prospect than navigating the actual city waiting for her outside. Her older sister Beatrice could not understand it. Beatrice, a telephone operator with a sharp wit and even sharper haircut, embraced the frantic energy of the decade. She spoke in a slang-filled patter that Lillian found bewildering, spent her wages on silk stockings and tickets to dance halls, and viewed Lillian's quiet life as a self-imposed prison. "For heaven's sake, Lily," she'd said just last Sunday over their shared pot roast, "you're young. You should be out there living. Go to a speakeasy, dance the Charleston, let a boy buy you some bootleg gin. You're turning into one of your dusty old books." Lillian had simply smiled and passed the gravy. How could she explain that the feeling of a perfectly balanced shelf, the crisp snap of a new book's spine, the quiet triumph of finding a misplaced first edition gave her a satisfaction more profound than any noisy, crowded dance floor ever could? How could she describe the thrill of journeying to far-off lands and forgotten centuries, all without leaving the comfort of her chair? To Beatrice, it was stagnation. To Lillian, it was infinity. The last book, a slim volume of Keats, found its home between Shelley and Byron. A faint smile touched her lips. She tidied her desk, emptied the dregs of her lukewarm tea, and retrieved her coat and hat from the staff cloakroom. The library was nearly empty now, a grand, sleeping giant. The green-shaded lamps cast pools of intimate light on the long reading tables, creating an atmosphere of scholarly devotion that soothed her soul. She took a moment, as she always did, to breathe it in, the scent of paper, ink, and time itself. The moment she pushed open the heavy bronze doors, the city assaulted her. The air, thick with the evening's damp chill and the scent of rain on hot pavement, was a jarring change from the library's dry, climate-controlled embrace. The noise was a physical blow, the clang of a streetcar bell, the insistent honk of a horn, a saxophone wailing from an open doorway somewhere down the street, its melody a lament of modern life. People swarmed the sidewalks, men in fedoras rushing home from work, women in cloche hats and fur-trimmed coats laughing in shrill bird-like bursts. Lillian pulled her plain wool coat tighter around herself, a small brown sparrow in a flock of peacocks. She clutched her handbag, her knuckles white. Her walk to the trolley stop was a daily gauntlet, a test of her ability to remain an observer, an island of calm in a rushing river of humanity. But tonight, the river was overflowing its banks. The trolley stop was a chaotic throng of damp, impatient bodies huddled under the small awning. A fine, persistent drizzle had begun to fall, slicking the cobblestones to a treacherous, opalescent sheen. The street lamps flickered to life, their gaslight casting a hazy yellow glow that seemed to make the shadows deeper and more menacing. Lillian stood at the edge of the crowd, her sensible shoes already beginning to feel damp. One trolley clanged past, already dangerously full, its windows fogged with the breath of its occupants. Another would be at least 15 minutes. Her small apartment, with its waiting copy of The Age of Innocence and a pot for tea, felt a world away. It was then that she noticed the alley. It was a narrow artery running between a brick-faced department store and a block of commercial offices. A shortcut. Her father, a man of rigid principles and unwavering routines, had always warned her against them. "The proper path is the proven path, Lillian," he used to say. "Shortcuts are an invitation to trouble." But the rain was turning colder, seeping into the collar of her coat. The press of the crowd was suffocating, and the thought of another 15 minutes in this clamor, being jostled and pushed, made her teeth ache. The alley looked dark, yes, but it was a straight line, a direct path to a quieter street 2 blocks over, a street where the trolley was always less crowded. It would shave 10 minutes off her journey, 10 minutes of peace. For a moment she hesitated, her father's voice a solemn echo in her mind. It was a small rebellion, a deviation from the carefully plotted narrative of her day. But the weariness won. It was just a few hundred feet of brick and shadow. What trouble could there possibly be? With a deep breath, clutching her handbag to her chest like a shield, Lillian Rowe stepped out of the bright, noisy chaos of the street and into the waiting silence of the alley. The sudden quiet was more jarring than the noise had been. The sounds of the city were instantly muted, replaced by the drip of water from a rusted drain pipe and the soft, hurried tap of her own footsteps on the wet ground. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of refuse and damp brick. The far end of the alley seemed a mile away, a small, beckoning rectangle of light and life. She fixed her eyes on it and walked faster, her heart beginning to beat a little too quickly. This was a mistake. She should have waited. She should have endured the crowd. Halfway through, a sound from the shadows ahead stopped her dead. It wasn't the scuttling of a rat or the moan of the wind. It was the sharp, metallic clink of glass on stone, followed by a low, guttural curse. Lillian froze, her body rigid with a primal fear she had only ever read about in Gothic novels. She was no longer an observer. She was in the story now, and she had the sudden, terrifying certainty that this was a chapter she had no wish to read. Before she could retreat, a black Ford Model T sedan, its engine unnervingly silent, rolled to a stop at the mouth of the alley, blocking her escape route and plunging her world into darkness. The darkness in the alley was absolute for a moment, the Ford's hulking frame eclipsing the distant street lamps. Then its headlamps flared to life, twin beams of brilliant white light that sliced through the drizzle and pinned Lillian in place. She was a moth caught on a collector's board, every instinct screaming at her to flee, but her limbs were locked in a paralytic terror. From the shadows near the far end of the alley, a figure detached itself. A man, large and imposing, took a step forward, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. "That you, Corrigan?" The voice rasped, coarse as gravel. "Heard you were sniffing around my territory." The driver's side door of the Ford opened, and another man emerged. He moved with an unnerving, fluid grace, the rain seeming to bead and slide off the fine wool of his dark overcoat. He didn't look at Lillian. His attention was fixed on the man at the other end of the alley. Even from this distance, she could feel the sheer force of his presence, an aura of cold, coiled power that seemed to lower the temperature of the air around him. "Your territory, Mackie?" The newcomer's voice was low, laced with a calm, mocking amusement that was more frightening than any shout. "I wasn't aware you owned the rats and the garbage. That's all I see here." More shapes materialized from the darkness behind the man called Mackie, 4, maybe 5 of them. The glint of metal caught the light. Lillian's breath hitched in her throat. Her mind, a repository of historical facts and literary plots, struggled to categorize what she was seeing. This wasn't a disagreement. It was a confrontation, stripped from the sensationalist headlines of the Boston Herald and made terrifyingly real. The man from the car, Corrigan, gave a barely perceptible nod. From the passenger side, another man, broad-shouldered and silent, stepped out, a Thompson submachine gun held low at his side. The weapon looked like a monstrous alien thing in the familiar setting of a city alley. "So you've got a lot of nerve, Artie," Mackie snarled, taking another step forward, "thinking you can just waltz in and—" He never finished the sentence. The world exploded in a cataclysm of sound. The deafening rat-a-tat-tat of the Thompson was a physical force, a brutal hammer against Lillian's eardrums. Muzzle flashes lit the alley in strobing, hellish bursts of light, freezing the scene in grotesque tableaus. A man's face contorted in a scream, another spinning backward, his hat flying from his head. The air, already thick with rain, filled with the acrid, sulphurous smell of gunpowder. Lillian didn't even remember moving. Instinct, raw and primal, had taken over. She was huddled behind a stack of overflowing wooden refuse bins, her body pressed against the cold, damp brick. Her hands were clamped over her ears, a futile gesture against the percussive violence that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images were already seared onto her mind. This wasn't a story. This was real. The sounds were real. The sharp crack of pistols answering the submachine gun, the splintering of wood as a crate nearby disintegrated, the wet, sickening thud of a body hitting the cobblestones. Her world, a place of quiet contemplation and intellectual order, had been turned inside out. The rules of logic and reason were gone, replaced by the brutal physics of lead and flesh. In her mind, she was frantically trying to find a reference, a passage in a book that could explain this, but there was none. No hero was coming. This was not a novel. It was a bloody, chaotic postscript that no one had intended to write. The roaring symphony of death lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was likely less than a minute. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier, more profound than before. It was a silence filled with echoes, thick with the coppery scent of blood that now mingled with the rain. Lillian dared to open her eyes. She peered through a gap between the bins. The alley was a charnel house. Several bodies lay twisted on the wet ground. The man called Mackie was slumped against the far wall, his form unnervingly still. The man from the car, Arthur Corrigan, stood in the center of the alley as if he were in the middle of a drawing room. He hadn't a single drop of blood on his immaculate coat. He calmly took a silver cigarette case from his inner pocket, selected a cigarette, and lit it. The small flame illuminated his face for a second, revealing high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that were a startling, icy blue. They were the eyes of a hawk, intelligent, merciless, and missing nothing. "Stanley," he said, his voice perfectly even. "Check them. Make sure it's done." The big man with the Thompson, Stanley, nodded and began to move methodically among the fallen, his expression impassive. Lillian knew she had to stay hidden. If she breathed, if she so much as shivered, they would find her. She tried to make herself smaller, to melt into the brick and the grime, praying for an invisibility she had always felt in a crowd but now desperately needed for survival. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Arthur Corrigan took a slow drag from his cigarette, the glowing tip a single point of fire in the gloom. He exhaled a plume of smoke that mingled with the mist. His gaze swept the alley, a king surveying the results of a swift and brutal campaign. He missed nothing. Not the fallen weapons, not the spreading dark pools on the cobblestones, not the slight tremor of the lid on the garbage bin to his left. His head turned slowly, and his ice-blue eyes locked directly onto her hiding place. There was no sound. The world seemed to stop. Lillian's blood ran cold. He couldn't see her. He couldn't possibly, but he did. He looked right at her, through the narrow gap, and their eyes met. In that moment, Lillian Rowe, the librarian, the observer, ceased to exist. She was only prey, discovered by the predator. He took another long, deliberate drag from his cigarette before dropping it to the ground and crushing it under the heel of his polished shoe. He walked toward her, his footsteps steady and unhurried on the slick cobblestones. Each step was a hammer blow to Lillian's heart. There was nowhere to run. He stopped in front of the bins and looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He was appraising. He was looking at her the way a collector might look at a rare butterfly that had unexpectedly flown in through an open window. "Well now," he said, his voice a soft, dangerous purr. "What do we have here?" Lillian could not speak. Her throat was constricted with terror. She could only stare up at him, her mind a blank slate of fear. Stanley approached, his large frame blocking what little light there was. "Artie?" "A witness." His voice was flat, stating a simple, brutal fact. "I'll take care of it." The implication was as clear and as cold as a shard of glass. Stanley raised his pistol. Lillian flinched, a small, choked sob escaping her lips. This was it. The final sentence of her short, quiet life, written in a dirty alley. But Arthur Corrigan didn't move. He held up a hand, a gesture of casual, absolute authority. "No." Stanley paused, confused. "But Artie, she saw everything." "Yes," Arthur said, his eyes still locked on Lillian's. "She did." He crouched down, bringing himself to her level. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a jarringly civilized aroma in the midst of the carnage. He was close enough now that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the almost imperceptible scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps not yet 30. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now, but no less menacing. Lillian," she stammered, the name a foreign sound on her own tongue. "Lillian," he repeated, tasting the word. He tilted his head. "You don't belong here, Lillian. This is no place for a little bird like you." He reached out, and before she could recoil, his gloved finger gently tucked a stray strand of damp hair behind her ear. The touch was electric, a brand of ice and fire on her skin. He stood up, turning his back on her for a moment to face his man. "The police will be here soon. Clean this up. Send a message to Mackey's remaining filth. Boston belongs to me now." "And her?" Stanley asked, jerking his head toward Lillian. Arthur Corrigan turned back. A strange, proprietary light entered his eyes. He looked at Lillian, huddled and trembling. A creature of paper and ink dropped into a world of steel and blood. He saw her terror, her wide, honest eyes, her utter displacement. And in that moment, he made a decision not born of strategy or necessity, but of something far more primal. Possession. "Her," he said, a slow, wolfish smile touching his lips for the first time. "She's a loose end." He reached down, his grip firm but not brutal on her arm, and pulled her to her feet. She stumbled, her legs weak and uncooperative. "And I don't like loose ends." He began to lead her toward the idling Ford, his grip an iron manacle on her arm. "So I'll be tying this one up myself. From now on, she's with me." Lillian looked back at the carnage, then at the face of the man who held her captive. The door to the black car opened like the maw of a beast as he pushed her inside, and the door slammed shut, plunging them into an intimate darkness. She knew her old life. The quiet world of silence and shelves was over. The book had been slammed shut, and a new, terrifying volume had just been opened. The ride in the Ford Model T was a blur of disjointed sensory details, a nightmare rendered in smudged charcoal. Lillian sat pressed against the plush leather of the back seat, as far from Arthur Corrigan as the confines of the car would allow. Yet she could feel the heat of his body, the unnerving stillness of his presence beside her. The silent giant, Stanley, drove with grim efficiency, navigating the wet, glistening streets of Boston as if they were veins in the palm of his hand. No one spoke. The only sounds were the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers, the low hum of the engine, and the frantic, riotous beating of Lillian's own heart. She stared out the window, watching the familiar city lights slide by, the warm glow of a bakery, the silhouette of a church steeple, the laughing faces of people huddled under an awning. They were scenes from a life that was no longer hers, a world from which she had been irrevocably severed. The alley had been a door, and Arthur Corrigan had pushed her through it, locking it firmly behind them. She risked a sideways glance at him. In the intermittent glow of the street lamps, his profile was like something minted on a Roman coin, sharp, severe, and impassive. He was looking straight ahead, his gloved hands resting on his knee. He seemed completely at ease, as if orchestrating a massacre and abducting a librarian were all part of a typical evening's business. The sheer incongruity of it was dizzying. Who was this man who could command such death and then sit in such perfect, tailored stillness? He must have felt her gaze, for he turned his head and met her eyes. The cold blue fire was still there, but now it held a flicker of something else, amusement perhaps, or curiosity. "Scared?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. Lillian flinched at the directness of the question. She wanted to scream at him, to rage, to demand he let her go. But the words were trapped behind a wall of fear. All she could manage was a tight, trembling nod, A corner of his mouth lifted in that ghost of a smile. "Good," he said softly. "You should be." He turned his attention back to the road, leaving her to grapple with the chilling finality of his words. The car soon left the bustling commercial districts behind, climbing the winding exclusive roads of Beacon Hill. Here the federal-style brick townhouses stood shoulder to shoulder, their windows glowing with the amber light of wealth and old-world propriety. They stopped before the most impressive of them all, a grand edifice of dark brick and white marble that commanded a sweeping view of the Charles River and the harbour beyond. A uniformed doorman, seeing the car, rushed to open the doors with a practiced deference that bordered on fear. Arthur led her from the car, his hand still a firm, inescapable pressure on her arm. They entered a lobby of checkered marble floors, gleaming brass and dark, polished wood. The air smelled of beeswax and money. They didn't wait for the main elevator. Instead, Arthur guided her to a smaller, private one of ornate wrought iron, unlocked with a golden key. The cage ascended in a smooth, silent glide. Lillian felt a rising panic, a sense of being drawn further and further into a web from which there was no escape. When the doors opened, they did not open onto a hallway, but directly into the apartment itself. It was less an apartment and more a palace in the sky. The sprawling space was a testament to a fortune as vast as it was dubiously acquired. Light poured from crystal chandeliers, glinting off silk-upholstered divans, lacquered Chinese screens and tables laden with silver trays of crystal decanters. A grand piano, black and gleaming, stood silently in one corner. But the most stunning feature was the wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic vista of the city lights twinkling below like a carpet of fallen stars. For a moment, the sheer, audacious beauty of it all stunned her into silence. It was a world she had only read about, a level of opulence that felt more fictional than real. "Stanley will bring your things," Arthur said, finally releasing her arm. The absence of his touch was as shocking as its presence had been. Lillian found her voice, though it came out as a ragged whisper. "My things, I don't understand. You have to let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear it. I saw nothing." The lie was flimsy, pathetic, and she knew it. He walked over to a polished mahogany bar, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass. He swirled it, the ice clinking musically. "Oh, but you did, Lillian," he said without turning around. "You saw everything. You're a witness. In my world, there are only 2 things to do with a witness." He took a slow sip of his drink. "You can silence them permanently, or you can own them." He turned to face her then, leaning back against the bar. The hard lines of his face were softened slightly by the lamplight, but his eyes were as sharp and penetrating as ever. "I find myself in a novel mood tonight, so I've decided to own you." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and absolute. Own, not protect, not hide, own, like one of the priceless vases on his mantelpiece or the silk Persian rug under her feet. Rage, hot and potent, finally burned through the fog of her fear. "I am not a thing to be owned," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I am a person, a citizen. You can't just do this." He actually laughed, a short, humorless bark. "My dear girl, I can do anything I want in this city. You learned that tonight in the alley, did you not? Your world of laws and librarians and overdue fines? It's a lovely story you tell yourselves to feel safe, but it's not the real world. The real world is what you saw tonight. It's about who has the power. And right now all the power is in this room." He gestured around the opulent space. "This is your new home, a gilded cage perhaps, but a comfortable one. You will want for nothing. Food, clothes, books. I'm told you like books." He nodded toward a door she hadn't noticed before. "I have a library that would rival a small corner of your public one. You will be safe here. No one will harm you. Mackie's friends will be looking for a witness, you see. Out there," he gestured to the glittering city below, "you wouldn't last a day. In here you are under my protection." "Protection?" She spat, the word tasting like poison. "You mean imprisonment?" "The distinction," he said, taking another sip of his drink, "is a matter of perspective." Just then Stanley entered from the elevator, carrying a small, worn leather suitcase. Lillian stared at it in disbelief. It was hers, the one she kept under her bed with her spare clothes and personal effects. How had they... She thought of Beatrice. Was she all right? "Your sister was most cooperative," Arthur said, correctly interpreting her horrified expression. A practical girl, that one. Stanley explained the situation, and she understood the wisdom of discretion. "She knows you're safe." The violation was profound. They had entered her home, her private space, the other half of her quiet, orderly world. They had touched her things, spoken to her sister, and erased her from her own life with brutal efficiency. Stanley set the suitcase down and retreated to the shadows by the door, a silent, ever-present guard. Lillian felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled her knees. She was trapped. Every avenue of escape was cut off. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone in the lion's den. She wrapped her arms around herself, a small, shivering figure in the vast, luxurious room. The beautiful view from the window now seemed mocking, a constant reminder of the world she could see, but no longer touch. Arthur watched her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant moan of a foghorn from the harbor. "There are rules in this cage, Lillian," he said finally, his voice losing its mocking edge and becoming flat, serious. 1, you will not try to leave. The doors are locked, and Stanley is always near. An attempt would be unwise. 2, you will not try to contact anyone from your old life. No letters, no telephone calls. Your sister knows not to ask questions. 3, when I am here, you will be in my presence. I like to keep my possessions where I can see them. He pushed himself off the bar and walked toward her. He stopped just before her, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He reached out and cupped her chin, his thumb brushing against her jawline. His touch was no longer gentle. It was a clear, unambiguous statement of ownership. "You are mine now, little bird. Learn to sing the song I want to hear, and this cage will be a very comfortable place. Try to fly away." He let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but perfectly understood. With that, he released her and turned away. "The room through that archway is yours. I suggest you get some rest. Tomorrow your new life begins." He walked toward the windows, his back to her, and stood looking out at his glittering, conquered city. He was the king in his castle, and she was his newest, most fragile acquisition. Lorn, exhausted and utterly defeated, Lillian picked up her suitcase. The handle felt foreign in her hand. She walked on trembling legs toward the archway, feeling his eyes on her back. As she stepped into the lavishly appointed bedroom, furnished with a soft bed and silk sheets, she closed the door behind her. It didn't have a lock. Of course it didn't. There was no privacy in a cage. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the worn leather of her suitcase a pathetic link to a life that already felt like a distant memory. Outside, the sounds of the city reached her, but they were different now. The wail of a jazz trumpet from a distant club no longer sounded vibrant and alive. It sounded like a lament, a sad, lonely song for a quiet librarian who had taken a shortcut through the wrong alley and had fallen out of the world. The days that followed bled into one another, a monotonous sequence of gilded moments. Lillian's life, once governed by the Dewey Decimal System and the gentle chime of the library clock, now followed a new, unnerving rhythm dictated by Arthur Corrigan. She would wake in her silk-sheeted bed to the muted sounds of the city coming to life far below. A silent, grim-faced woman named Mrs. Gable would bring her breakfast on a silver tray. Then she was left to the vast, silent emptiness of the penthouse. She spent most of her time in the library Arthur had mentioned. It was a magnificent room, paneled in dark cherry wood and lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound first-edition volumes. It should have been her paradise, but it felt like a mockery. The stories of brave heroes and triumphant love seemed to taunt her from the shelves. She was a character in a different kind of book now, a dark, modern novel with no clear moral and a terrifyingly unpredictable protagonist. Arthur was a phantom. He would be gone when she woke, his empire of speakeasies and smuggling operations demanding his attention. But he would return in the evenings, bringing the scent of the city of cigar smoke and bootleg whiskey into the sterile opulence of the apartment. His presence filled the space, charging the air with a tense, watchful energy. As per his rule, she was required to be in his presence. She would sit in a wing-back chair in the main room, a book open in her lap, pretending to read. He would pour himself a drink, perhaps look over some ledgers or simply stand by the great windows, a dark silhouette against the city lights. Sometimes he would speak to her, his questions like stones dropped into a still pond. He asked about the books she read, about the history of Boston, about the obscure poets she admired. His intellect was sharp, his curiosity genuine, and that, she found, was the most disorienting thing of all. She had expected a brute, a common thug. She was not prepared for a man who could discuss the merits of Whitman's prose one moment, and she had no doubt, order a man's death in the next. She answered him in clipped, cautious monosyllables, refusing to give him any more of herself than he had already stolen. She built a wall of silence around her, her only remaining defense. Her quiet defiance seemed to amuse him. He never pressed, never raised his voice. He simply watched her, his ice-blue eyes missing nothing, as if he were patiently trying to solve a complex and fascinating puzzle. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her captivity, the routine was broken. She was in the library, tracing the spine of a worn copy of Moby Dick, when she heard the private elevator arrive with an unusual clatter. A moment later, Stanley appeared in the doorway, his normally impassive face etched with urgency. "He's hurt," was all he said. Arthur followed him in, leaning heavily on Stanley's shoulder. His fine overcoat was torn at the sleeve, and a dark, wet stain was spreading across the side of his tailored suit jacket. His face, usually a controlled mask, was pale and tight with pain. Even so, he straightened up when he saw Lillian, shrugging off Stanley's support. "It's a scratch," he rasped, though the sweat beading on his forehead told a different story. "Mackie's boys," Stanley elaborated, his voice a low growl. "A roadside ambush. We took care of them, but one got lucky." Arthur waved a dismissive hand. "Get Mrs. Gable, and bring the medical kit from my study." Stanley hesitated, his gaze shifting from his boss to Lillian and back again. "She's not here tonight. Wednesday, her day off." A flicker of annoyance crossed Arthur's face. He pressed a hand to his side, and Lillian saw him wince. "Damn. Fine. Get the kit. I'll manage." As Stanley disappeared, Arthur made his way to a leather sofa, moving with a stiff, painful deliberation that stripped away his usual veneer of fluid invincibility. He sank into the cushions with a sharp intake of breath. For the first time since she had met him, Arthur Corrigan looked vulnerable. He looked human. Lillian stood frozen in the doorway, her heart a conflicted drum. A part of her, the part that had been terrorized and imprisoned, felt a grim, dark satisfaction. But another part, the part that had been raised on stories of compassion and decency, saw only a man in pain. Stanley returned with a metal box and a bottle of whiskey. He set them on the table. "I'll get him out of this coat," he grunted. The process was agonizing. As Stanley carefully peeled away the layers of expensive fabric, the white shirt beneath was revealed to be soaked in blood. A ragged tear in the material showed the wound itself, a deep, ugly gash along his ribs. It wasn't a bullet hole, but it was bad. A knife wound, deep and vicious. "Get some hot water towels," Arthur ordered Stanley, his voice strained. As his man left the room, Arthur's eyes found Lillian's. She was still standing in the doorway, a book clutched to her chest like a shield. "Don't just stand there like a statue," he bit out, the pain making him cruel. "Make yourself useful, or get out." The harshness of his words broke her paralysis. Before she could think, she was moving. She set her book aside and knelt by the sofa. Her hands, trained in the delicate work of repairing torn pages and cracked spines, were surprisingly steady. "Let me see," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked at her, surprised by her initiative. He hesitated, then gave a curt nod. She gently pushed aside the torn fabric of his shirt. The wound was bleeding sluggishly, the flesh around it already beginning to look inflamed. It needed to be cleaned and stitched. She had learned basic first aid during the Great War, volunteering to roll bandages at the local church. It was a distant, almost forgotten skill, but it came back to her now. When Stanley returned with a basin of steaming water, Lillian took charge. "Put it here," she commanded, her tone so authoritative that the big man complied without question. "And the kit." She worked with a focused intensity that left no room for fear. She washed her hands, then began to clean the wound with an antiseptic from the kit that made Arthur hiss in pain. She ignored his curses, her touch gentle but efficient. She found a suture needle and gut thread. "This will hurt," she warned, looking him directly in the eye. He stared back, his blue eyes narrowed, searching her face. He saw no fear, no pity. He saw only a fierce, unexpected competence. He clenched his jaw and gave a single, sharp nod. She stitched the wound with small, neat stitches, her movements precise and economical. He did not make another sound, though she could feel the muscles in his side bunching into knots of agony under her hands. As she worked, the silence in the room was thick and intimate. The only sounds were the soft snipping of the thread, the clink of instruments in the metal box, and their shared breathing. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound tightly with clean strips of linen. Her work was done. She sat back on her heels, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her hands trembling slightly. "You'll live," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't look at him. She was suddenly acutely aware of their proximity, of the scent of whiskey on his breath, of the raw intimacy of what she had just done. She had touched the man behind the monster. He was silent for a long moment, studying her. "Where did a librarian learn to do that?" he asked, his voice rough. "The war," she replied, still looking at the floor. "Everyone learned to do something." He continued to stare at her, a strange, thoughtful expression on his face. The cold mask was gone, replaced by something more complex, something she couldn't decipher. He had seen a part of her he had not expected, a strength that belied her quiet, bookish exterior, and she, in turn, had seen a chink in his armor, a moment of weakness that made him terrifyingly, complicatedly human. "Clarence Mackey is getting bold," he said, more to himself than to her. "He knows I have a weakness now." His eyes flickered toward her, and she understood. She was the weakness. Her existence was the one unpredictable variable in his violent equation. The attack tonight wasn't just about territory. It was a message they were hunting for her. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the sofa. His skin was hot. "Thank you, Lillian," he said, and the simple words, devoid of mockery or command, were more shocking than any threat he had ever uttered. His touch lingered for a second too long, a spark of heat that traveled up her arm and settled deep in her chest. She pulled her hand away as if burned and rose to her feet, retreating to the safety of the library doorway. The fragile truce was broken. The dynamic between them had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. He was still her captor, and she was still his prisoner. But tonight, for a few brief, terrifying moments, they had simply been a man in pain and a woman who had helped him. And that, Lillian realized with a fresh wave of fear, was a far more dangerous situation than before. The aftermath of the attack settled a new kind of tension over the penthouse. Arthur's wound healed quickly, a testament to his formidable constitution, but the incident had left an indelible mark on their strange cohabitation. The wall of silence Lillian had so carefully constructed had been breached. Now, a fragile, unspoken awareness existed between them. He watched her not just as a possession, but as a puzzle he was growing more determined to solve. She, in turn, could no longer see him as a simple monster. She had seen his vulnerability, felt the warmth of his skin, and heard a genuine note of gratitude in his voice. It was a dangerous complication. His recovery period confined him to the apartment more than usual. He conducted his business from his study, a room of dark leather and cigar smoke where men with hard faces and guns holstered under their coats came and went with quiet urgency. Lillian would retreat to the library, but the thin walls could not block out the low murmur of his voice as he gave orders, his tone the cool, sharp edge of a razor. She was living in the nerve center of a criminal empire, an unwilling confidant to whispered conspiracies and plans written in blood. One rainy afternoon, she found him not in his study, but in the main room, standing before the great windows. A half-empty bottle of Irish whiskey and a single glass stood on the table beside him. He had been drinking, not with the social grace she had seen before, but with a grim, solitary intensity. He didn't seem to notice her presence as she hovered in the archway, a book held forgotten in her hand. He was staring down at the city, but his focus was distant, lost in a past that Lillian could not fathom. The hard lines of his face seemed deeper, etched with a profound and startling melancholy. He looked less like a king surveying his kingdom, and more like a man marooned on a lonely island of his own making. Driven by a curiosity that overrode her caution, she took a hesitant step into the room. "Are you all right?" The question was quiet, tentative. He started turning from the window. His eyes, usually so sharp and focused, were clouded. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "All right?" He gave a short, bitter laugh and poured another generous measure of whiskey into his glass. "Peachy." He gestured with the glass toward the city. "Do you know what it takes to build all that, Lillian? To own it?" He took a long drink. "It takes sacrifices. You have to cut away the parts of yourself that get in the way. Kindness, trust, love. You carve them out one by one, until all that's left is a piece of steel sharp enough to do the job." Lillian remained silent, sensing that this was not a conversation, but a confession, poured out to the only person available to hear it. He walked over to a heavy, ornate desk in the corner of the room and pulled open a drawer. He fumbled inside for a moment before withdrawing a small, velvet-covered box. He brought it back to the table and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was a photograph of a young man and woman. They were standing on a pier, the ocean behind them, smiling with the unburdened joy of youth. The man was a younger, softer version of Arthur, his eyes full of a light she had never seen. The woman beside him was beautiful, with dark, laughing eyes and a mass of auburn curls. "My brother, Walter," Arthur said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "And his fiancée, Evelyn." He stared at the photograph, his thumb gently tracing the edge of the image. "We built this thing together, Walter and I, from nothing. Just a couple of kids from Southie with empty pockets and big ideas. He was the heart of it. People, they loved him. He could talk anyone into anything. I was the fist, the muscle." He downed the rest of his whiskey in one swallow, the raw spirit doing little to dull the pain in his voice. 5 years ago. We were moving a shipment up from New York, a new supplier. Walter trusted them, I didn't. I told him it was a trap. He said, I didn't trust anyone. Arthur's voice cracked, a sound as shocking as a fault line opening in granite. He said my suspicion would be the death of us. He went to the meet alone to show me I was wrong. He paused, the silence stretching out, heavy and suffocating. They found his body in the harbor 2 days later. He was unrecognizable. The raw agony in his words struck Lillian with the force of a physical blow. The invincible Arthur Corrigan, the cold-blooded king of the underworld, was built on a foundation of grief and guilt. The steel he had described was forged in the fire of that loss. "The supplier," he continued, his voice hardening again, the familiar coldness returning like a sheet of ice. "They worked for a man named Moretti, the man who used to run this city before me. I spent the next 2 years hunting them down, every last one. I made Moretti watch as I took everything from him, his business, his men, his life. I cut out the last part of my heart and used it to build this throne. Walter was right. My suspicion wasn't the death of us. His trust was." He looked up at her then, his eyes burning with a desperate, drunken intensity. "Do you see now, Lillian? Trust gets you killed. Kindness gets you betrayed. In this world, the only thing you can rely on is what you can hold, what you can control." His gaze swept over her, and she felt a chill creep up her spine. What you can own. The confession was a key, unlocking the dark chamber of his soul. But the revelation did not bring her closer to him. It terrified her. She was not just a prisoner, she was a symbol. She was the one pure, untainted thing he possessed, a living testament to his power to control the uncontrollable. His strange fascination with her, his possessiveness, it wasn't about her at all, it was about his brother, it was about a ghost. The knowledge was suffocating. She had to get out, not just for her freedom, but for her very soul. To stay here was to become a part of his darkness, a fixture in his gilded monument to pain. That night, as the penthouse lay cloaked in silence and Arthur slept a heavy, whiskey-induced sleep, Lillian put her desperate plan into motion. She had been observing for weeks. She knew Stanley changed his guard position at 3 a.m., moving from the chair by the private elevator to the one by the main entrance for half an hour. She knew there was a service staircase at the end of the hall, used by Mrs. Gable. Its door was always locked, but she had seen where the housekeeper kept the key, on a small hook behind a potted fern. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped from her room, her feet silent on the thick rug. She was dressed in her plainest clothes, her worn suitcase left behind. She could take nothing with her. She retrieved the key, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely fit it into the lock. The click of the tumblers sounded like a gunshot in the silent apartment. She opened the door and slipped into the darkness of the stairwell, pulling the door quietly shut behind her. She was free. She practically flew down the flights of stairs, her breath coming in ragged sobs of fear and relief. Down, down, down she went, through the sleeping heart of the building. When she reached the ground floor, she found the service exit unlocked as she had prayed it would be. She pushed the heavy door open and stumbled out into a back alley, the cool night air a shocking, glorious balm on her face. For a moment, she was dizzy with the sheer, intoxicating reality of her freedom. The city was quiet, sleeping under a blanket of stars. She had done it. She began to run, her sensible shoes slapping against the pavement, putting as much distance as she could between herself and the cage. But as she rounded a corner onto a main street, a pair of headlights flared to life, pinning her in their glare. A black Ford Model T idled by the curb. The passenger door opened. Arthur Corrigan stepped out. He was fully dressed, his hair perfectly combed. He looked as if he had been waiting for her all along. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't even angry. His face was a mask of glacial calm, but his eyes, His eyes burned with a cold, terrifying fire she had never seen before. "Did you really think," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "that I would leave the door to my cage unlocked?" The hope that had soared in her chest plummeted, turning to a stone of pure dread in her stomach. Stanley emerged from the driver's side, his expression grim. She had never been free. It had all been a test, a cruel, calculated test, and she had failed it. He walked toward her, and this time there was no pretense of civility, no hint of the broken man she had seen just hours before. This was the predator, cornering its foolishly errant prey. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "You disappoint me, Lillian," he hissed, his face close to hers. The smell of whiskey was gone, replaced by the cold scent of the night. "I thought you were learning. I thought you understood." His grip tightened and she cried out in pain. "I will not be a ghost in your mausoleum," she choked out, defiance and terror warring in her voice. His reaction was swift and violent. His rage, born not of calculation but of a deep personal wound, finally broke through his control. It wasn't just the fury of a captor whose prisoner had tried to escape. It was the raw, betrayed anger of a man who thought he had found the one thing he could trust, not to leave him. He shoved her back toward the car, his movements rough and unforgiving. "Get in," he commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "The lesson is over. Now your real education begins." As Stanley forced her into the back of the car, the fragile trust that had begun to form between them shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked at Arthur's face, now a mask of cold fury, and saw no trace of the grieving brother, only the ruthless king, and she knew, with sickening certainty, that she was more a prisoner now than she had ever been before. The ride back to the penthouse was a study in absolute silence, a vacuum more terrifying than any shouted threat. Lillian sat huddled against the door, the chill of the window pane seeping into her thin dress. Arthur sat opposite her, a statue carved from rage and ice, his gaze fixed on the passing city lights, refusing to acknowledge her existence. The air crackled with his unspoken fury. He had not laid a hand on her since shoving her into the car, but the violence in his stillness was a palpable force. Back in the apartment, the gilded cage felt smaller, the air thicker, suffocating. He didn't speak to her. He simply pointed toward her room with a curt, dismissive gesture. "Go!" The quiet command was more chilling than any punishment. He was locking her away, not just physically, but emotionally, exiling her from the strange, charged space they had begun to share. The door that had no lock now felt as impenetrable as a vault door. For the next 2 days she was a true prisoner. Mrs. Gable left her meals outside her room on a tray, knocking once before retreating. She saw no one. She heard only the muffled sounds of Arthur's empire running without her. The silence from him was a form of torture, a constant gnawing reminder of her failure and his absolute power. Her brief taste of freedom had only sharpened the agony of her confinement. She had seen the stars, felt the night air. Now the panoramic view from the penthouse windows felt like a cruel taunt. The city was a world she would never touch again. The hope she had foolishly nurtured had withered and died, leaving only a cold, hard knot of despair in its place. On the third morning, the silence was shattered. The sound of the elevator arriving was followed by Stanley's voice, low and urgent, from the main room. Then Arthur's voice, sharp and laced with disbelief. Lillian crept to her door, pressing her ear against the cool wood. "What do you mean, gone?" Arthur's voice was a low growl. "Her sister, Beatrice," Stanley explained, his tone grim, "didn't show up for her shift at the telephone exchange this morning. Her landlady hasn't seen her since last night. Mackie's work, it has to be." Lillian's blood ran cold. Beatrice. Oh God, not Beatrice. Her pragmatic, life-loving sister, who had nothing to do with this dark, bloody world. This was her fault. Her escape attempt must have made Arthur's enemies realize how important she was to him. They had missed their target, so they had taken the next best thing. A heavy object crashed against a wall in the other room, the sound of Arthur's control finally snapping. "He's using her as bait," he snarled. "He's calling me out." A moment later, a telephone rang, its shrill, insistent jangle cutting through the tension. Lillian heard the scrape of a chair, the heavy click of the receiver being lifted. Arthur's voice was dangerously calm. "Corrigan." There was a long pause. Lillian held her breath, her entire body trembling. "Mackie, you son of a bitch," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a near whisper yet carrying more menace than any shout. "You touch one hair on her head." Another pause. Lillian could imagine the sneering, triumphant voice on the other end of the line. "I see," Arthur said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The old shipyard, Pier 4, midnight, and Mackie. Come alone. If I see anyone else, the deal is off, and you can explain it to your new boss in hell." He slammed the phone down. The sound echoed in the silent apartment. "It's a trap, Artie," Stanley said immediately. "He'll have the whole place crawling with his men. He wants to take you out and get the girl. He'll be a hero to what's left of his crew." "Of course it's a trap," Arthur bit out. "What does he want, a trade? Her for her?" He meant Lillian. He was going to trade her for Beatrice. The thought was a strange, conflicting agony. Freedom at the cost of her sister's life? Or worse, would Mackie simply kill them both once he had what he wanted? Lillian's mind reeled. She couldn't stay hidden any longer. She threw open her door and ran into the main room. Arthur and Stanley turned, surprised by her sudden appearance. Arthur's face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes chips of blue ice. "You can't," she pleaded, her voice ragged. "You can't trade me. He'll kill Beatrice. He'll kill us all. This is my fault. Let me—" She didn't know what she was going to say. Let her go to them. Give herself up. Arthur looked at her, and for the first time in days the glacial anger in his eyes thawed, replaced by a raw, complex emotion she couldn't name. It was a look of profound weariness, of a man cornered by a fate of his own making. "This stopped being about you a long time ago, Lillian," he said, his voice rough. He turned to Stanley. "Get the car ready, and get the boys. All of them. Tell them to be at the shipyard by 11:30. Silent. No one moves, no one breathes until I give the signal." Stanley nodded, a grim understanding on his face, and left through the elevator. Arthur walked to his study and returned with 2 pistols, checking their chambers with practiced efficiency. He tucked one into a holster under his arm, and the other into the back of his waistband. He looked not at Lillian, but out the window, at the grey, indifferent sky. "He doesn't want a trade," Arthur said quietly. "He wants a war. He wants to prove he can take what's mine." His gaze finally shifted, and his eyes met hers across the room. The unspoken object of that sentence hung in the air between them. "He wants to prove he can take you." "You're not going to trade me," she whispered. A statement, not a question. "No," he confirmed. "I don't trade my possessions." The word, which had once sounded so brutal and proprietary, now carried a different weight, a declaration of protection, however twisted. He was going to war for her and for the sister, who was her only link to the world he had stolen her from. The hours leading up to midnight were the longest of Lillian's life. She watched him prepare, a general readying himself for a final, decisive battle. He moved with a lethal calm, his earlier rage channeled into a cold, sharp focus. He said nothing more to her, but she felt his awareness of her in every corner of the room. She was the still point in his storm, the reason for the thunder about to break over the city. When the clock on the mantel chimed 11, he put on his dark overcoat, the fabric hiding the weapons beneath. He walked to the door of the elevator, then stopped, his back to her. "Stay here, don't leave this room," he commanded. "When this is over, one way or another, Stanley will come for you." He stepped into the elevator without looking back, and the wrought iron doors slid shut, separating them. Lillian rushed to the window, her hands pressed against the cold glass, and watched as the black Ford T pulled away from the curb far below, a single dark vessel sailing into a sea of violence. The shipyard was a skeleton of rusted steel and rotting wood, silhouetted against a sliver of moon. Fog rolled in off the harbour, muffling sounds and cloaking the derelict warehouses in a damp, ghostly shroud. Arthur walked alone down the length of the pier, his footsteps echoing on the damp planks. At the end of the pier, under the single buzzing glare of a cargo lamp, Clarence Mackie was waiting. He was not alone. 2 of his thuggish men stood beside him, and a third held Beatrice, a gag over her mouth and her eyes wide with terror. "Corrigan!" Mackie shouted, his voice unnaturally loud in the foggy quiet. "I knew you'd come. Always had a soft spot for your property." Arthur stopped 20 feet away, his hands held open at his sides. "Let the girl go, Clarence. She has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with this," Mackie laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's the sister of your little library mouse, the one you've got tucked away in your castle. Word gets around, Artie. People say you've gone soft, keeping a pet. Well, tonight I'm taking your pet, and your kingdom." He gave a signal. From the shadows of the warehouses, a dozen more men emerged, guns drawn, surrounding the pier. It was just as Stanley had predicted. A trap. Arthur's face remained impassive. This is between you and me. Let her go." Mackie's smile was pure malice. "No, I think I'll start by sending you a piece of this one. A message for the librarian." He nodded to the man holding Beatrice, who pulled a long, wicked-looking knife. Beatrice whimpered behind her gag, tears streaming down her face. It was in that moment that Arthur Corrigan made his choice. It was not a choice for his empire, for his power, or for his pride. He looked at Beatrice's terrified face and saw not a stranger, but Lillian's sister. He saw a piece of the quiet, orderly world he had shattered, and a debt he had to pay. "All right, Mackie," he said, raising his hands slowly in a gesture of surrender. "You win." A triumphant grin spread across Mackie's face. He had done it. He had broken the untouchable Artie Corrigan. "That's more like it," he sneered. "Now, your guns." Slowly. As Arthur reached slowly into his coat, his eyes flickered to a rusted bell on a post at the edge of the pier. It was the signal. He moved with a speed that was inhuman. He didn't draw his pistol. Instead, he drew the one from his waistband and fired twice. Not at Mackie, at the heavy iron bell. The loud, discordant clang-clang of the bell was the thunderclap that broke the storm. And from every shadow, every crate, every darkened doorway, hell erupted. The night exploded with the deafening roar of Thompson's submachine guns. As Stanley and Arthur's men opened fire, Mackie's men, caught completely by surprise, were cut down in a brutal, efficient fusillade of lead. In the ensuing chaos, Arthur lunged forward. He ignored the men falling around him, his focus entirely on the man holding Beatrice. He fired once, a precise, calculated shot, and the man dropped. Arthur shoved Beatrice behind him, shielding her with his body. The firefight was short and savage. When the last echo of gunfire faded across the water, the only men left standing were Arthur's. Clarence Mackie was on his knees, a spreading red stain on his shoulder, his pistol lying on the planks beside him. Arthur walked toward him, his own gun now held steady in his hand. His face was a mask of cold, righteous fury. "You were wrong, Clarence," Arthur said, his voice quiet in the sudden silence. "You thought she was my weakness." He stood over his defeated rival, the barrel of his pistol aimed at Mackie's head. "You were right." He pulled the trigger. The single shot was the final, brutal punctuation mark. He stood for a moment over the body, the fog swirling around him, the king who had just paid a bloody price to protect his queen. Then he turned, his expression unreadable, and walked toward Beatrice, who was huddled on the ground, sobbing. He cut her bonds and removed her gag, his movements gentle. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe." He then looked up into the darkness, to where Stanley was already emerging from the shadows. "Take her home, then go to the penthouse. It's time to end this." Lillian paced the vast expanse of the penthouse, a ghost haunting the scene of her own life. Every distant siren, every backfire from a car on the street below, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her veins. The city, usually a glittering, indifferent jewel, seemed menacing tonight, its shadows holding the secret of Arthur's fate. She had lost all track of time. Midnight had come and gone, and now the sky was beginning to soften in the east, the blackness fading to a bruised, pre-dawn purple. She hugged her arms to her chest, the silk of her dress feeling impossibly flimsy, an inadequate shield against the cold dread that had settled deep in her bones. She found herself praying. She, a woman of logic and literature, was praying with a desperate, primal fervor to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. She prayed for Beatrice's safety, for the sister whose vibrant life she had so carelessly endangered, and to her own profound confusion, she prayed for him, for the safety of the monster, the captor, the grieving king who had gone to war for her. In the crucible of this long, silent night, her feelings had been stripped of their complexity, boiled down to one terrifying, undeniable truth. She could not bear the thought of a world without him in it. The telltale chime of the private elevator was the sound that both saved and damned her. Her head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. The wrought-iron doors slid open. Stanley stood there, his large frame filling the entrance. His face was grim, his suit smudged with grime, and he had a fresh cut over his eye. But he was alone. Lillian's legs gave way, and she sank onto the arm of a nearby sofa, the last of her strength deserting her. It was over. Stanley had come for her just as Arthur had said, but he had come alone. The king was dead. A wave of grief, so powerful and unexpected it stole her breath, washed over her. It was a physical pain, a hollowing out of her chest. Stanley stepped into the room, his expression softening slightly as he took in her desolate state. "Miss Rowe," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He's waiting for you. In the car." Lillian's head shot up. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through the fog of her despair. "He's alive." A rare, fleeting smile touched the corner of Stanley's mouth. "It takes more than a punk like Mackie to kill Artie Corrigan. He's banged up, but he's alive." The relief was so overwhelming it left her dizzy. She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't care about the details of the battle, about the bodies left on the pier. She only cared about the one fact that mattered. He was alive. She followed Stanley into the elevator, her movements stiff and dreamlike. The descent was a journey back to the real world, a world of consequences and choices. The car was waiting at the curb, its engine a low, comforting thrum in the quiet dawn. Stanley opened the back door for her. Arthur was slumped in the corner of the back seat. In the faint grey light he looked exhausted, his face pale and bruised, his immaculate coat stained and torn. There was a crude bandage wrapped around his left forearm, but he was whole. He was there. He looked up as she slid into the seat and their eyes met. The icy blue was muted now, clouded with pain and a weariness that seemed to go soul deep. The king had won his battle, but the victory had cost him dearly. Lillian opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. What could she say? "Thank you. I'm sorry. I was terrified I'd lost you." The sentiments were too large, too fraught with the complicated history that lay between them. He spoke first, his voice rough. "Your sister is safe." Stanley took her home. "She's shaken but unharmed." "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. He gave a slight, dismissive shake of his head, as if her gratitude was an irrelevance. The car pulled away from the curb, but it didn't turn back toward the opulent neighborhoods of Beacon Hill. It headed south toward the working-class districts, toward the part of the city where Lillian's old life had been. "Where are we going?" she asked, a new uncertain fear beginning to dawn. "I'm taking you home," he said, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery of her old neighborhood. The words didn't make sense. Home? But the penthouse. "The penthouse was a cage, Lillian. You were right," he said, his voice flat. "I thought I could own you. I thought I could lock away one good thing in my life and keep it safe from the filth. But the filth always seeps in. I brought the war to your doorstep. I almost got your sister killed. I put you in more danger by keeping you than I ever would have by letting you go." He turned to face her, and the raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes made her heart ache. "This ends now. It's over." The car pulled to a stop at the end of her familiar street. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the edges of the brick buildings in soft shades of rose and gold. It was a new day. Her old life was waiting for her, just a few feet away. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a thick envelope. "This is for you. Enough to go anywhere you want. California, Paris, London, anywhere you can be safe, away from me and this city. A new start." He was letting her go. He was giving her the freedom she had so desperately craved, and now that it was here, it felt like an amputation. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice trembling. "Take it," he insisted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Consider it payment for services rendered." He was rebuilding the wall between them, brick by painful brick. He was the gangster, and she was the witness he was paying off. It was the only way he knew how to do this. He placed the envelope on the seat between them. A chasm. "And if I don't want to go anywhere?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question was audacious, terrifying. It was the bravest thing she had ever said. He looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes before he extinguished it. "You have to," he said, his voice ragged with a finality that broke her heart. "Lillian, look at me. Look at what I am. I'm a killer, a monster made of grief and violence. I live in the dark. You belong in the light, in your world of books and quiet decency. I almost pulled you into the darkness with me. I won't make that mistake again." It was the first truly selfless thing he had ever done. He was setting her free, not for his own sake, but for hers. He was cutting out the last, most vulnerable part of his heart and letting it go, because it was the only way to save it. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image. This was it, then. The end of the story. A beautiful, tragic end. She reached out, and before he could pull away, her fingers brushed against his. His skin was cold. "Was any of it real?" she whispered. He held her gaze for a long, agonizing moment. His mask of control was absolute, but she could see the truth in the depths of his eyes. "It was the only real thing that's happened to me in 5 years, he admitted, his voice hoarse. "And that's why I have to let it go." He gave a curt nod to Stanley. The door beside her opened. The cool morning air rushed in, freedom. Lillian got out of the car, the thick envelope feeling like a lead weight in her hand. She stood on the sidewalk of her old life and watched as the door of the black Ford T swung shut. The window rolled down, and she had one last look at Arthur Corrigan's face, a portrait of magnificent, lonely sacrifice. Then the car pulled away, disappearing down the street, leaving her alone in the quiet dawn. She stood there for a long time, the rising sun warming her face, the sounds of her city waking up around her. The book of Arthur Corrigan was closed. She was free to write her own story again. The choice was hers. She could take the money and run, find a new library in a new city, and try to forget the king who had reigned over the darkest chapter of her life. Or she could stay. She could stay in Boston, in this city that was his and now somehow hers too. She could wait, because she knew something that Arthur, in his noble sacrifice, had failed to understand. Monsters could learn to live in the light, and even the quietest librarian could find she had a taste for the dark. The story wasn't over. It was just the end of the first volume. She turned and walked toward her front door, the envelope still in her hand. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time she wasn't afraid of the unknown. She was ready for the next chapter. The story teaches us that true strength is not in possessing another, but in having the courage to let them go for their own well-being. It explores the idea that even the hardest hearts can be cracked open by an unexpected connection, and that love isn't about changing someone, but about inspiring them to become the best version of themselves, even if that means a future apart. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more epic romances that defy time and circumstance. Your next great love story awaits.